Today's message is lessons from Paul in Athens. Paul as a guide to sharing the gospel, and we're going to do a bunch of reading first, so we all understand the passages that we're going to look at today, starting at Acts 17, verse 16, and we're going to go all the way to 34. So let's start at 16. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. So he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. And also some of the Epicureans and the Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Some were saying, "What would this idle babbler wish to say?" And others, "He seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, May we know what this new teaching is which you are proclaiming. For you are bringing some strange things to our ears, so we want to know what these things mean. Now, all the Athenians and the strangers visiting were used to spending their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation and mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist. For even some of your own poets have said, for we are his children. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think of the divine nature as like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof of all men by raising him from the dead. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, We shall hear you again concerning this. So Paul went out of their midst, but some men joined him and believed. Among them also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So that's a lot. The difficulty we have with preaching with Acts is that it's not straightforward teaching. And our protagonist, in this case, isn't Jesus. Someone who we can rely on. But Paul and his companions, yes, godly men, but fallible men all the same. Add to this, Acts is a narrative. It's a description of what happened rather than what should have happened or what we should do. It's not talking about that. So the book becomes ripe for misinterpretation and misunderstanding. But we've been given an account, or this specific account, all of Acts, for a good reason. And Luke provides a good outline for how we might engage the increasing hostile culture that is around us. Yes, Paul is a missionary, and most of us are not missionaries, but we are all called to the Great Commission. and we should take that call seriously. And our Australian society seems to be separating further and further from the Christianity that was so prominent even 30 or 40 years ago, making our relations to our acquaintances, our colleagues, and our friends closer and closer to that of Paul and the Athenians. In other words, we're growing apart. There's a divide. So, as we go through these verses, I would like to highlight 5 points that I think are applicable for today that Paul experienced in his day. The first one being, we should be provoked by the idols around us. Second, we should find common ground. Third, we should start at the beginning. Fourth, we should know the culture around us. And fifth, we should present the whole gospel. And now you can go to sleep because you know all the points. So, a little bit of context. Paul is in Thessalonica in chapter 16, preaching to the Jews, as he always preached to the Jews first. And the Jews were upset that other Jews were going and following Paul and Jesus. And their accusations point to the fact that Christianity had already built something of a reputation. Acts 17:6 says, when they did not find them, that being Paul and Silas, they began dragging Jason, who was a companion of them that lived in Thessalonica, and some brethren before the city authorities, shouting, these men who have upset the world have come here also. They all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. Imagine that.
Oh no.
So Paul and Silas sneak off to Berea. And when it's discovered that that's where they are persecuted even further by the Thessalonians. But instead of everyone fleeing, this time it's only Paul who leaves for Athens. And this is actually independently verified in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians 3:1. He says, therefore, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to be left behind at Athens alone. And so this is where we start. Okay, now, while Paul was waiting for them, that's Silas and Timothy, at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him, and he was observing this city full of idols. So he was reasoning in the synagogues with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. So Paul arrives at Athens. Athens at this point in history is a city well into decline, no longer holding the prestige that it once did. It was a free city, but still under Roman control, and the Romans loved everything Greek culture, so that helped. But by Paul's day, the city had a population of no more than 10,000 people, and despite its decline, Athens was still completely full to the brim with idols. From verse 16, we get the immediate impression that it may have been Paul's intention to wait for his companions before he started his ministry. But the idolatry of the locals proved too much for Paul. He was provoked into action. The word here, provoked, is the same as what's used in the Septuagint to refer to God's anger against Israel's idolatry. So Paul is provoked to anger at the idolatry. He goes to the synagogue and reasons with the local Jews and the God-fearers there, God-fearers being the Gentiles who believed in the one God. And he also goes into the marketplace and talks to whoever will talk with him. And this is the first point. We should be provoked by the idols around us. And let's not be naive. There are idols everywhere. They are just lightly veiled idols. In Desiring the Kingdom, James Smith sets out a method for finding these idols in a secularized society. He says, human persons are intentional creatures whose fundamental way of intending the world is love and desire. This love and desire is always aimed at some vision of the good, some particular articulation of the kingdom. What primes us to be so oriented is a set of habits that are formed in us through bodily practices, routines, or rituals that grab hold of our heart through our imagination. What does this mean? It means that people's love and desires are conditioned by the things that they do. Or, to put it more simplistically and a little bit wrong, people do what they worship. And their view of the good life, the kingdom, is influenced by these actions. So if the good life is perceived to be hedonism and pleasure, people's actions will idolize the things that allow them to have those: money, sex, food, possessions, etc. Like this. It's a bit small writing, sorry. This is an Apple ad, and on the top, finally. This is religious language. Our desires are about being fulfilled, and Apple is telling you, finally, you can be fulfilled. While idols in secularized society are hidden or even denied, in Athens, their idols were out on public display, and it provoked Paul to act. We should be provoked to act amongst our culture of idolatry. Moving on to the next. And we continue. And also some of the Epicureans and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Some were saying, "What would this idle babbler wish to say?" Others, "He seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities," because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is which you are proclaiming? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears, so we want to know what these things mean." Now, the Athenians and the strangers visiting there are used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. So, along with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, Paul talks to the Athenian pagans. Luke mentions two groups in particular, the Epicureans and the Stoics. Both of these philosophical schools started about 300 years BC and would last another 300 years after Paul, before the rise of Christianity and Neoplatonism would eventually see their demise. Their names are still used today, except in more watered-down context. Epicureans were atomic materialists, and their system of knowledge was based solely on the senses. While materialists, they were not atheists, but for them, the gods were disinterested in human affairs and did not interfere. Ethically, they were hedonists, meaning the good life for them could be determined based on pleasure or at least a lack of pain or discomfort. So, they have a bit of a different idea of hedonism. Natural and necessary passions should be sought after, and above all else, which would include clothing, shelter, and food. And seeking after these things was the greatest good. Where the Epicureans saw the good life as achieving pleasure or avoiding pain in all things that are natural and necessary, Stoicism was a pantheistic philosophy of achieving the good life through the four virtues: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. And to avoid the passions: distress, fear, lust, delight. Ethics were determined by wisdom, self-control, and being free from the passions. They believed everything was guided by blind fate. It was a pagan philosophy, but the church fathers would widely borrow from it, since there was a lot of parallels and philosophical agreement, particularly in respect to virtue ethics. But that wasn't close enough agreement for Paul and his Stoic hearers, so these philosophical schools found Paul's teaching to be quite unusual, and they asked, what would this idle babbler wish to say? And he seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities. The idle babbler describes, it's like, it comes from a word where birds pick up things here and there for nests. So they'll pick up a button, and they'll pick up a rock, and they'll pick up a shiny thing, and they'll make their nest out of all this stuff that's disorganized and messy. Well, it's a bit like that. It's someone who picks up little pieces of information here and there and then puts them all together and discusses it as if it's their idea, but it actually doesn't make any sense at all. So it's someone pretending to be intelligent when actually they're the opposite. And they don't actually understand what they're saying. The proclaimer of strange deities is either a more serious charge, or Luke is framing Paul's discussion with these people he's met in the marketplace in light of Socrates. Now, if you've been into my Mark Bible study, we have talked about biblical authors framing people in certain ways. So Matthew frames Jesus as Moses, Mark frames John the Baptist as one of the prophets, Elijah, and he frames Jesus as kind of Israel, embodied in Jesus, Israel as like one person. And so this is not a strange thing to do. And in fact, other people would defend their philosophers because Socrates by this time had been such a popular figure, other authors would defend their own philosophers by making that charge or by putting those words into their opponent's mouth. So proclaimer of strange deities, and it would be actually kind of like almost a good thing. Because they were, putting him in line with Socrates, being like, oh, look at this guy's like Socrates, people don't like him, people do this and that. So, yeah. So Luke's either doing this in order to make Paul like Socrates and framing him within that ancient world, or there's a serious charge being made. And we don't know which one this is. It could be both, but it doesn't seem like Paul is actually defending his charge when we get later on. So it's a bit of an interesting sentence. One thing is certain, though, they didn't understand Paul's message. They think he's preaching about two deities, and this being Jesus and his consort, Anastasis, which would be the resurrection. So they think Jesus and the resurrection are two different deities, and he's preaching about these two deities. So they don't understand what's going on. So Paul is taken to the Areopagus. The Areopagus was the city council of Athens and was used as a court and a place to exchange ideas. Luke says the Athenians spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing new things, which might imply that the people of Athens are not really interested in the truth, but only in hearing something new. So interested, in fact, that if they're making a charge against Paul here, which is possible, by the end of him talking, they completely forgot about it. So we move on to Acts 17, 22 and 23. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you." Now, despite being angry about the idolatry, Paul begins his speech by establishing common ground. He says he noticed this altar to an unknown God, and Paul uses this as a springboard to discuss the God they do not know. He tells them that he notices they are very religious, which for them would have been a compliment, maybe not so much today. And he kind of hints that there is something, to something that he will later explicitly state, that though they're misguided, through these idols, these people are groping for God. They're trying to find him. We too need to establish common ground with those we talk to. Nothing has changed. Idol worship is, and always will be, groping for the true God. Whether people realize it or not, they are searching for something to fix the world. The new wave, then there's various examples of this. There's a new wave of cultured Christianity. As the West has shifted leftward, some that used to be in the middle, or just left of the middle, have began crying for the return of a cultured Christianity, a Christianity almost seemingly without belief, where they're calling for the return of Christianity, but at the same time, they're not Christians. So, I've seen this from the Australian Libertarian Party, people like Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, who's openly gay, Ben Shapiro, who is openly Jewish, or who's Jewish and rejects Christianity. And just a couple of days ago, Christianity Today had a thing on Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist who actually wants to see Christianity pretty much obliterated. And he stresses that we need Christianity in light of the current cultural climate and what's going on. None of them are Christian, but they are still groping for God, looking for his kingdom, and they've seen it within what Christianity has offered society and our Western civilization, and now that it's going away, what's replacing it, and they're scared, as they should be. And even for the extremes of our culture, even for the people who have replaced the void that has been taken out of the Western civilization with the removal of Christianity, there seems to be a lot of common ground. Environmentalists can learn that we as Christians are meant to be stewards of our environment. Social justice gurus can learn that God desires justice and wants to bestow us with the tools to bring justice and fight evil and the evil one through the armor of God. And so there's lots of room still, despite the growing gulf that we're experiencing, there's still room for common ground. And there was room for common ground with Paul, who had an even bigger bridge to build. So Acts 17, 24 to 25. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything. Since he himself gives to all people life and breath to all things. Paul now moves on to attack idol worship. He is going to use both Jewish and pagan arguments against idol worship. God is the creator of heaven and earth, and this is straight from Genesis 1, but the second half echoes the words of Solomon during the temple dedication. In 1 Kings 8:27, it says, "But will God truly dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built?" And many of the pagan philosophers also understood that you couldn't contain God within a building. So it wasn't just it's a pagan argument as well as a Jewish one. Because God created everything, he can't be housed in anything made with human hands. This the Stoics would have agreed with. God's ultimate position also means that he has no needs that humans could fulfill. So third, we need to start at the beginning with most people. I take, for example, the atheist trope of this flying spaghetti monster. The argument is literally nonsensical because our current culture doesn't understand who we say God is. If we don't start at the beginning, there's only going to be confusion, misunderstanding, and talking past people. Perhaps, this is what Paul experienced at the beginning of these verses when talking in the marketplace, since they were all confused about Jesus and his consort resurrection. So it's important that we not just jump into Jesus. And Paul doesn't just jump into Jesus and the resurrection here. He starts with God created everything, God is bigger than everything, and he moves on from there. And the gap is growing so big, we can't just assume God anymore. We need to build bigger bridges and start with a foundation. Acts 17, 26 to 28. "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and their boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each of us. For in him we live and move and exist. As even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. Now, Paul continues his argument from the beginning. God made all the nations from one man, Adam, and determined the comings and goings of men and nations, and this contradicted the Stoics' belief in blind fate. Then Paul quotes Greek poets to further his argument. We are God's offspring, and God is not like material things such as gold and silver. And, in other words, they're idols. This is in direct contradiction to the Epicureans, who believed the gods were far off and uninterested with the affairs of man. Paul then goes on to both allude to and quote Greek philosophers and poets to strengthen his argument. But both quotes are actually about Zeus. Paul is reinterpreting them to suit his own purposes. So, I missed that one. So, we need to know the culture around us. And what does that look like? So that we can reinterpret the culture to make it Christian, basically. Because Paul wasn't afraid of doing that. He takes two quotes that are about Zeus and he makes them about God. So, first of all, our culture is materialistic, both metaphysically, which means that we are materialistic in the sense that most of us, at least innately, because this is how we're raised, believe that only the physical exists and nothing else. There is no higher thing, there's no heaven, there's no angels, there's just our physicalness. And the other way we're materialistic is that it's socially. So this is the keeping up with the Joneses, that we have to feed that desire to have more and more and more. The second thing we need to know about our culture is that we're philosophically postmodern. This is a deep distrust of not just institutions, but narrative. In recent years, this has been revised to be a deep distrust of only certain institutions and narratives which comes from certain backgrounds, namely Western civilization, or as some people would say, dead white men. So different competing narratives are told that more closely align with the emotive beliefs of the culture. And especially recently, this would be things like diversity, inclusion, and equity. And we have those things because of the last one, which is the emotive or feelings-based culture. Dilemmas are solved with an appeal to emotional states. Ethically, modern Australian culture is hedonistic, pain is avoided, and pleasure is sought. Phrases like, whatever makes you happy, are classic examples of this. And because of that emotive feeling, because we internalize all of our ethics and make it about my feelings, we choose to idolize our identity. And our culture tells us that we need to be authentic, true to ourselves, and we can forge whatever identity we want to make, even changing things like gender. But we struggle to form an identity from the inside out because in ourselves we have no foundation in which to form an identity. Andrew Potter writes in the Authenticity Hoax, eventually, each of us, he's not a Christian by the way, and he doubles down on consumerism, so eventually each of us has to look in the mirror and ask, what is worth doing? Or what is meaningful? Or what is sacred? These are all versions of the same question. And what they amount to is, who am I? Religions give a ready-made answer to that question. But modernity, or post-modernity, probably more accurately, sweeps away all previous answers, undermining any notion of the sacred. And so the liberal answer to these questions is nothing, or slightly better, it's up to you. We must recognize that our own solution, the confused and self-defeating search for something called authenticity, is itself nothing more than a hoax. So in this book, Potter sees the modernist project as not only something that is inescapable, but also something that we shouldn't escape from. Religion is to be treated with suspicion, and modernity has cleared the way for most everything else. So what else is there? Well, that's up for you to decide. We have become gods, seemingly forming our identity ex nihilo, or out of nothing. But even Potter will admit, your identity is not yours at all. It is a consumerist hodgepodge, a product of compartmentalization, peer pressure, and slick advertising. This has hollowed out the ethical norms formulated by the Judeo-Christian worldview and has left a vacuum that is slowly eating away at our culture, making a lot of people in Australia deeply unreligious and hostile to Christianity. In his speech in First Things, former chief rabbi of Great Britain, Jonathan Sacks, said, "The West places its faith in a series of institutions, none of which can bear the weight of moral guidance: science, technology, the state, the market, and evolutionary biology. Science tells us what is, not what ought to be. Technology gives us power, but cannot tell us how to use the power. The liberal democratic state, as a matter of principle, does not make moral judgments. The market gives us choice, but it does not tell us which choices to make. Evolutionary biology tells us why we have certain desires, but not which desires we should seek to satisfy." Oh, sorry, I wrote that wrong. Evolutionary biology tells us why we have certain desires, but not which desires we should seek to satisfy and which to not. It does not explain the unique human ability to make second-order evaluations. The result lies all around us: the collapse of marriage, the fracturing of the family, the partisanship of politics, the loss of trust in public institutions, the buildup of debt, individualism, hedonism, consumerism, relativism. We are collectively powerless to move beyond them. Can civilizational decline be arrested? So this is what idolatry has done to the West. We have hollowed out their Christian ethic and replaced it with the self. And we need to know that, or we need to be aware of that when we talk to people about the gospel. Moving on. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art or thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, "We shall hear you again concerning this." So Paul went out of their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom were also Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So Paul, who is possibly on trial for his life, demands his audience, the people who might be trying him, to repent. He tells his listeners that the time for their ignorance is over. Jesus has died and God has vindicated him through his resurrection. And now, because there is no excuse for ignorance, God will judge the world, and ignorance is no longer an excuse. So Paul presents the whole gospel to the culture. He presents the whole gospel to a culture that would likely find it unappealing. And in fact, many do find it unappealing. And they find it unappealing because of the resurrection. Because Neoplatonism, which is the culture of the day, is building up. And they dislike the physical because everything is about the Platonic forms, spiritualness. So the idea of resurrecting physically is repugnant to them. But Paul still says it, because without the resurrection, there is no Christianity. So he doesn't shy away from the gospel. The idea of resurrection, coming back to physical form, was, to many Greeks, not something to be celebrated. The rise of Neoplatonism meant that physicality was despised and the spiritual forms were looked on as the ideal. Paul didn't care, and neither should we. We need to tell the full gospel. We need to tell our culture that repentance is required, that there is a God who upholds universal moral standards, and that there is a plan to save us because we can't meet those standards. None of these things are viewed well in today's culture, where resurrection is seen as weird or unscientific or impossible, or and there being a moral center is considered distasteful and like bigotry. But the gospel, the full gospel, must be preached. So we'll just end in prayer.